Okay.
Got it. So let me start off with just a very brief introduction, Brian, and then we'll let you start chatting a bit about the work you're hoping to do as part of your sub-project. So something I noticed, and I didn't realize this, and maybe it's because I'm really dense, but you got a PhD from Boston Universities, right?
Yes, right.
Boston University. Did you
Yeah.
know Patrick when you were there?
No. Yeah, I looked at some point during the grant proposal process. Am I correct? Are you at the medical school?
Yeah, I was at the medical. Yeah, I still have an appointment there. I'm living in Minneapolis now.
Oh, I'm from Fargo, North Dakota. So we have a double connection.
Yeah,
Midwesterners.
right. I was in Fargo maybe 6 months ago.
Yeah. So that's a better time to go than now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. So I was going to mention that you spent some time after getting your PhD at the University of Washington.
No, I
And
did my
then-
PhD at Boston University.
Right. And then you were at the University of Washington.
Yeah, right.
Right. And then you moved, you stayed in the northern tier of the United States and moved to Fargo, I guess, to experience the winters, besides the opportunity there. And then eventually you went to the University of Groningen.
Right.
Pronouncing it right, I'm sure.
That's good.
Groningen, something like that, right?
Yeah.
And I think I had told you before, I had visited Groningen myself a couple of times. I had known a neuropsychologist there, Ed van Zomeren, who probably is retired now. Enjoyed the town very much.
Yeah.
When one looks at your expertise, I think I found, or I observed, that one of your areas of expertise is meaning in life.
Right.
So I need this conversation, Brian. I can tell you that. I've been looking for that baby, so maybe you can give birth to it during our conversation. Seriously, Brian is the one of the PIs on our sub-projects, and Brian is project, broadly speaking, is investigating the idea of awe. Oh, we all look for awe occasionally. Metaphor, which is something we all try to extract from our ongoing interactions with the world, and mysticism. And I bet there's not one person that comes to view this little interview who hasn't had a mystical experience of some kind. Yeah. So with that brief introduction, we're really happy to have you as a leader of one of the sub-projects of our John F. Templeton grant. And why don't you tell the audience, people who'll be viewing this, just a little bit about your role in the sub-project that you're leading. And I'm sure Patrick will have questions as we go along. So feel free, go ahead.
Good, thanks. I mean, a couple of preface remarks. One is a great bow of gratitude to the Templeton Foundation and to the Ability Lab for having this grant mechanism. I think it's been, for me, it's a great opportunity to re-engage with things that have been some of my deepest and longest interests. So actually, I did my undergraduate in religious studies, and I did a master's in religion as well. And my central interests around that were meaning in life, religious experience, particularly influenced by Rudolf Otto's work, the idea of the holy. So to be able to come back to this, and it's always been in the background for me, but to be able to come back to this in a deeper way is really, I'm very appreciative. A secondary remark I'd like to make is that, yeah, it's a project that not just me, for sure, and Professor André Aleman, who's a neuroscientist here at the University of Groningen, has played an instrumental role. So he's also the co-PI, but I'm just here representing the group. So as far as the project itself, please stop me if I go on too long, because I do have a lot of enthusiasm about this. At a very broad level, and I'll try to make this somewhat brief, it's built on observations that a number of cultural thinkers across disciplines, philosophers, psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists have made, that with modernity, there's been a radical shift within the West from a culture in which, I guess you can say, an intuitive mode, a mode in which we were more deeply engaged relationally with the world, with ourselves, with others, with the divine, with nature, to one in which abstraction has become really predominant as a criterion with the scientific revolution, with the Enlightenment, the ability to have rationality, logic, and abstract out the information, mathematical information from the world, has been, of course, tremendously powerful, a miracle, but that there's been something that's been lost in that, a loss of a way of being in the world that has more of this relationality to it. And so within Christianity as well, or religion more broadly, there's this idea, a critique, an observation that previously metaphor and relationality were deeply important, but with different cultural events, again, Enlightenment, scientific revolution, propositional thought as having truth value, it became really predominant. And so then some of the early adherents of the scientific method, Francis Bacon, John Locke, said, well, look how powerful science is. Let's put religion's propositions to the test to see if it's actually true in this same sort of way. But I think there's all sorts of evidence that in these arguments that's not what much of religion is about. It's about relational. It's about making connection. It's about value and using metaphor as a way to do that. So this is the starting point of our work, is to say, are there different ways, a literal reading of religious text, like the Bible, or a more metaphorical, symbolic way of reading it, with the idea that the symbolic, metaphoric was primary as far as the history of theological interpretations with the Alexandrian school. And are there ways that sort of interpretive way of engaging religious narrative can be enhanced? And we came across this idea of awe as, for a number of reasons, can potentially lead to a more of an intuitive mode and more of a metaphorical engagement with religious texts. And I'll leave it there because it's starting to go on a bit long. So what our plan then, our proposal is to examine this with Christian participants and have them have one of several different types of awe inductions versus other sorts of emotion inductions via film, and then to see whether that changes the way that they engage biblical text or near biblical text, and whether or not it makes it more metaphorical, looking at some of the potential mechanisms, including neural mechanisms. So that's, I feel like that's too long and too short at the same time.
That sounds wonderful, Ryan, and it's great how you're grappling with these great big themes, but in a very focused, methodologically rigorous, scientific experimental manner. So you're gonna have two experimental inductions, it sounds like, one inducing an awe experience, the other one an equally intense emotional experience, and then see to what extent your Christian participants engage with biblical material. Is that right? And you're going to be measuring.
Yes.
What aspect of neural activity will you measure?
Well, if I can go back just
Please.
a little bit to some of the methods.
Yeah.
In part because I'm avoiding the neuroscience question, because André Aleman is the neuroscientist, and he'll be able to speak a lot better to that than I will. But with the methods, so we'll have both a positive awe induction and a threat awe induction, and there's some reasons for that. I mean, classically, going back to Rudolf Otto's book, he talks about the experience of the numinous, essentially awe, as something that includes both this fascination, being utterly drawn to this, to the source of this experience, and a terror.
Yeah.
So we're in much of the awe research that's being done now is more along the positive sorts of awe inductions. There's been some. Gordon is one of the studies that's somewhat more recent, and maybe one or two others have been starting to use threat awe inductions, which I think is an excellent methodological advance. So we will have, positive and threat awe induction, then a positive and threat non-awe induction, and then a control, a non-emotional neutral control.
Okay.
And then as far as the texts, we're piloting these now, looking at both biblical texts that could be interpreted literally or more metaphorically. Like, for example, might be instantiations of the creation or miracles. But also our thought is that perhaps there can be a lack of variability, of too high of a floor, too low of a ceiling effect for people who are committed Christians, and we will have committed Christians as the participants. So there may not be as much wiggle room for influences of the awe induction. So we're also looking at a couple of other ways of looking at religious texts. So one is religious texts in which it's not so much of a positive experience. So the wrath of God, or kind of irrationality of God with the command of Abraham to kill Isaac, or the Battle of Jericho, breaking down the walls and destroying the city, and these sorts of things. So that's another category. And then a third category we're looking at are apocryphal texts. So with Protestants, and the northern part of the Netherlands is mostly Protestant, so they won't have as much familiarity with apocryphal texts. And so taking stories from this, accounts such as Jesus telling the disciples to dip a hook into the water and they'll get a penny, a coin that will take care of them. And then to give them these sorts of texts and look at their interpretive reaction to those. So that's some of the basic methods. Regarding the neural perspective.
Before you get into the neural perspective, let me ask what you think about the historical validity of the metaphorical interpretations you're going to extract. So do you think when the Bibles were first written, that people who started to read them then had the same cognitive abilities to develop metaphors that people currently have? And if not, do you or don't you? I don't know.
That is an excellent question. That is such a good question. I really like that. The interpretation of myth, like some of the early interpreters of myth, like I think E.B. Tyler and some of these folks, they were Enlightenment thinkers, and then they just projected back to the pre-modern cultures as saying, this is just science, but bad science, right? Whereas I think other thinkers, as time went on, said it's just a different way of thinking. Philosophers like Ernst Cassirer, Eliade, psychologist Carl Jung, this is just a different way of thinking. And without the development of the Enlightenment, Descartes, scientific revolution, there's not this distinction between subject and object. And then you can talk about things as being literally true or symbolically true. So there's
but Brian, do you think then that religions could become religions simply based on metaphors?
Well, I just want to say one more thing, which is Owen Barfield is another thinker who's talked a lot about metaphor. He's one of these inklings with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And his idea, is, if I recall correctly, is that it's only with modernity that we can talk about metaphor. Previous to that, it was a sense, there wasn't this subject-object distinction in which you could talk about having metaphor as a way of getting from the subject to the object. And thus you can think of metaphor as trying to create that bridge that was a chasm, to bridge that chasm that was made with scientific revolution and the apotheosis of propositional thought, of the distinction between subject and object. So metaphor can be thought of as a way of trying to come back to that, at least to some extent. So okay, I'm not sure, this is just coming back with one more iteration, that my sense, which I know nothing about, but that would be that, can you see your question again in regards to all of this, of whether pre-moderns people would have religion, is that?
Well, the last question was, I was just sort of thinking, if people in the past, surrounding the times when myths and non-witnessed, in particular, myths and the first text, the first printed or verbally transmitted aspects of the Bible, if people had simply taken, if people had chosen to decide to understand them as in the sense of metaphor, right, as opposed to being depicting a realistic event that occurred, right, could a religion have been established simply based on metaphorical interpretations of important text?
I don't, well, but then that's presupposing an ability to have an extended systematic ability to have logical scientific thought. Could they then use metaphor, then say we're going to use this as metaphor and develop a religion? But that wasn't the case, I don't think.
Well, yeah, that's sort of what I was getting at. Exactly. I was getting at the fact that probably a lack of metaphorical thinking made these experiences that were transmitted to others be so real and so awe-inspiring in some sense.
Yeah.
And that cemented somebody's commitment to a way of being.
Yeah, but what I would wonder then is, when you say it makes it so real, what do you mean by real? So recently I was rereading some Mircea Eliade's Sacred and Profane. And something that struck me is a line in early chapters is that the pre-modern people had a deep instinct for reality. They wanted the real. And I was thinking that because I'd previously been thinking a bit about the Enlightenment and scientific revolution in regards to philosophy, with this Greek philosophy, with Plato's idea that we have an instinct for the real, right? With the allegory of the cave. And then there's these nice, thought experiments by Nozick of the experience machine. Would you want to be hooked up to this machine and you're unconscious, but like if everything is just like reality and it's great, it's perfect, just in just the amount of chaos that you need, but that means you're never woken up again. That you have to stay in there until you die. Would you want to do that? And that's a sense of reality. Most people say, no, I wouldn't want that because I want to have reality. But the type of reality that science talks about, or the type of reality I think that Nozick is talking about, is to some extent different than the type of reality that Eliade is talking about. What I understand him talking about is that pre-moderns and moderns, or postmoderns, may still have an instinct, a desire to be connected with reality of like this unseen reality of pattern that feels more real. So with Eliade, you go back with the rituals to the original acts of creation. And then when you have this act of creation or participate in this ritual, you're connecting back to that, but that is a deeper reality than your material life. And it seems like this is, with the psychedelic, I know a little bit about that, of this in Hood's work, also with mysticism, more generally, like this noetic quality, a quality that this is more real than my everyday life. So yes, I could imagine very much that the pre-moderns, the time of when these books, or the oral tradition first, and then the books, the Old Testament, New Testament, that it really grabbed people's attentions because it gave them a sense of reality, but not necessarily perhaps in the sense of propositionals that have a truth value.
So maybe before we forget, just even crudely, you don't have to go into great detail. Can you describe the quote unquote neuroscience method? So what are you going to use to look at the brain's activity when you're doing these tasks?
Right. So they'll do some of the biblical and non-biblical texts at a baseline session at home. And then they come into the laboratory and it's a scanning. So they'll do functional MRIs while they are getting the induction of the emotion control, and then reading the texts and giving their responses to these texts.
And you have the scanners at the University of Groningen. You have it there.
Yes. Yeah. At the medical school has
the medical school. Yeah. Great. Yeah. And so presumably, as you look at your various conditions that you described earlier, you might see similar or dissimilar patterns, right, of activation, depending on how you're inspiring their reactions. No.
Yeah. We hope so.
Well, let's say I'm trying to think of what the predictions might be, so if the group that gets the positive interprets the biblical texts more metaphorically, let's say, or more richly, or extract more meaning from it, then the group that gets the threat condition, that seems like a reasonable thing to expect, like people who get a positive experience and it's connected with awe would extract more meaning from it, it seems to me. But the ones who get the threat, I mean, terror management theory would probably predict that that would cause a much more quote unquote religious interpretation.
Religious in the sense of propositions?
Well, I'm not sure what they would say. I mean, their whole theory, from how I understand it, is people build up cultural worldviews because of mortality salience. The more exposed you are to threat, the more likely you'll create a defensive personal system, draw on the culture, and build up a religious worldview. But I mean, so what are you guys expecting from those two conditions versus control?
Yeah, that's a really nice question, and nice to bring in the terror management theory work. I hadn't thought about it particularly from that perspective. Yeah, regarding the positive versus threat awe, I mean, a couple of things. So one, as you say, that we would expect that the positive will lead to more metaphor for for several reasons. One is that the positive could likely lead to a greater element of intuition, of trust and intuition. So this is one of our proposed mediators, both by self-report, trust and intuition. This is based off some of Seymour Epstein's work, his cognitive experience self-theory, and he has a nice measure of trust and intuition. We've used some other ones as well. And kind of related to that is the positive emotion part. So like the Fredrickson built, I can't remember, she had a very clever thing about saying about positive emotion. But it allows you to, you're more likely to have the appetitive motivation of moving out, right? Versus a threat, then you're moving in a defensive sort of way. And I would suspect, though, with the kind of from the terror management theory and kind of the threat theory, is that doctrine would have more benefit be more attractive than metaphor, from the sense that doctrine is more of a closed system, and it's this is how things are. Whereas metaphor, I think the key part of metaphor is that it's an open system. It has implications, and so that can be threatening. But if it's done in a positive awe induction, then I suspect that the implications are ones that make one feel connected to something more. So yes, I would say that the positive awe induction, I would suspect, will have more of the influence on the metaphorical reading than the threat awe.
There's a bunch of, sorry, Jordan, just one quick follow-up question. There's a bunch of work done on the cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience of ritual, which links it to threat appraisal systems, threat avoidance systems. So it'd be interesting to see to what extent the threat condition taps, those ritual mechanisms.
Could you just say another word about that? I'm really interested.
I was just trying to remember the authors. It was a couple of anthropologists. I can't remember them right
There's
now.
this guy, I can pronounce his name right, Zigalatas.
Oh no, that's Dimitri. Yeah, he will know about that.
Okay.
I think he's reviewed that literature. No, this was the guy who made the claims about counterintuitive representations being the basis for supernatural agent cognitions.
Oh, this is
same guy.
Valdisono, something like this, and Graham. But he's the awe.
I can't remember. I'm terribly sorry. Anyway, there might be a link between threat appraisal and ritual. Might be worth investigating. But I mean, you've got so much going on there already that you're going to have a very, very rich data set. And clearly there's going to be big brain activity differences, I imagine. I mean, whenever you give threat stimuli, you engage the fear extension circuit, the amygdala, all that sort of stuff. Whereas, but do you know? I think it's Keltner, Dr. Keltner's work on I think he's done some. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, he's done some excellent.
Yeah, yeah. So, but I was going to say, I think he's done some neuroimaging under an awe condition, but maybe I'm not right.
Just a shout out to the Dutchies. There's another fellow here, Michael Van Elk, who does some really excellent research down the south. He's at Leiden now, and he's also done some research on awe with neuron. And I think he found that it led to a reduction in the default mode network, which I think is along the lines of some of the things you all think about.
And that's what you see in the psychedelic literature, with the ego dissolution experience. You get a sort of disconnectivity within the default network structures, and then hyperconnectivity between the default mode network and other areas of the brain.
Yeah, so something in one of your other discussions with a PI, I can't remember who it was, but this point came up, which is, you can have these ineffable experiences, which is awe and luminous, and then afterwards there's an attempt to make it effable, to communicate somehow. And so I think that this is a theory of some folks regarding myth, that it's you have the experience of the numinous, and then myth comes out, but myth as metaphor, but it's not as a way only to describe it, but as a way to continually engage it, right? Because metaphor is alive because it's not a closed concept. It has implications. It only works by implication. There's a really nice, so I think you'd also talked about this Ian McGilchrist in one of the other, or more of the other interviews too, which is his Master and Emissary book is just, I think, immensely profound and wonderful. But what I really like And so he talks about these different ways of engaging the world with propositions, but there are non-propositional ways that are as well deeply important. And he gives an example of a joke, right? So it only works because of all the things that are implied. But once you make those things implied explicit, it's no longer a joke.
Yeah.
So I think somehow like thinking about myth or metaphor is that it has the stuff that's implied that draws you forward, that you can still kind of engage with it. It's not just this is what it is and end of story. It's something that's alive.
Dan Sperber and his groups back in the 80s talked about in their work on pragmatics, the amount to which something created a chain of inferences. You know, they called it relevance, you know, but it operates very much the same as metaphor. You know, something that really triggers a bunch of counterfactuals or a chain of inferences. But not, and they did experiments where you could look at the extent to which something was pragmatically relevant in a social context by the number of inferences that event generated in the individual.
That's really interesting. So so there's I have Sperber on my shelf that I haven't read yet, but it's a nice prompt. Also, there's Jerome Bruner, the literature.
The narrative.
He talks about this too with narrative mode versus logical scientific mode. That's implications, implicatures.
Sure.
And I think so. Something I just want to ask you too. Like, if I'm curious if your thoughts about this. So there's research then with metaphor. When you have metaphor to describe something, it has more implicatures. It has more chains of inferences, right? So there's this nice research. I can't remember the authors, but if you say like this person was angry versus this person blew her smokestack, something like that, right? And then they look to see whether or not they endorsed inferences regarding causality, intentionality, and the behavior. Like she was it was out of her control. She blew up out of her control. She blew up because she was under a lot of pressure, and so on and so forth. And so something that I'm kind of curious about. So when you have metaphor, then it's a richer sort of world that you're pointing to than something that's just a proposition. So I'm wondering that if with metaphor, is there even more of a sense of a personal relation, a personality behind the metaphor? If you have the metaphor of the divine, then if you use just a literal word, God is this.
Well, it certainly allows for elaboration, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about your inducements.
Yeah.
So is there a way to fractionate to some degree the aspects that are contained in the inducement? Just to give you a dumb example, I'm good at dumb examples, sorry. It's just my maybe reflects something there. But so let's say something induces a positive emotion, but it's also propositional in nature. You have to explain to somebody what or somebody has to observe a context that you interpret as awesome, say. So you have the feelings about it, the intensities, but you also have a way of interpreting it. And I'm wondering if that's the case in your studies, whether you're going to ask, for example, people to rate the inducements at all in terms of intensity or of emotion or some other aspect, so that, let's say, in the end, if you wanted to control the inducement effects upon people making metaphors or understanding metaphors, what if you, for example, subtracted out the intensity effect or the emotion effect? Would you still have the desired outcome based on your hypotheses, or at least you could look at that? You know what
No, that's excellent. And so we have some of that, but now as you're talking, that actually strikes me as some things to additionally think about and include. So yes, we do have, at the moment, the plan is to have, of course, how much awe did you experience, but also positive emotion, negative emotion, and uncertainty. And we are piloting the positive emotion that's non-awe and the threat emotion that's non-awe. We're piloting to try to get them to be close in the positive emotion and negative emotion. But the intensity part is a really good point as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's, if there's a way that you could control, the level of intensities,
Yeah,
that would be wise. And that's the easiest way, what Jordan's talking about, it seems to me, is just have them rate,
yeah,
the
yeah.
induction. Yeah.
And there's like some really interesting findings, right? I think it was like an awe induction, and then looking at something about science, liking science, and it was all as a function of positive emotion. It wasn't a function of awe. So as you say, like, if you don't measure these things, then you're going to get some wrong inferences.
So are you going to also, I'm sure the viewer here has heard, you're going to get mostly Christians, probably because it's the Netherlands, I guess, in some sense.
Yeah, but that's not so easy. It's one of the lesser religious countries, like the Czech Republic,
Right.
Netherlands, the Scandinavians. But yeah, there's a Bible Belt here too. So we'll get
so in your description, what we may say the demographics of your sample, are you going to ask them if they've experienced awe before and how much, so that you'll know the relationship of their performance in your studies to what they might have experienced in their lives before they came to your study?
That's another very nice point. Another thing that I will add, we did think about this, but we were thinking about it something along the lines of a moderator, and we weren't thinking about just trait awe. But what we were thinking about is awe or transcendent experiences during spiritual practice while praying, with the idea that people who have more of those sorts of practices and more of those sorts of experiences as a function of prayer will have a stronger effect of the awe induction on the dependent variables. But your point of just to make sure that the groups are not different and their susceptibility to awe, specifically susceptibility to awe, is a very good one. We also have other moderators that are related to susceptibility of awe, like autism traits, schizotypy traits, and so on. But we hadn't actually thought about including specifically trait awe, which is, I think, a good suggestion.
So are you going to have, let me just ask one more question, Patrick, and then I'll be quiet there.
Yeah.
So there are standard tests of metaphors, right? I mean, you alluded to people who have done studies looking at metaphoric processing. Are you going to administer those just to get a sense, just to get a sense of how well people might perform in a neutral task, looking at let's just call it metaphoric ability in some sense?
Yeah. So we will have a couple of things in regards to that. So one, they at the baseline, before they come to the lab, they will rate 10 biblical texts, 10 non-biblical texts on metaphoricity. So that would be some element, some sense of their individual differences. Also, there's a measure of literal versus symbolic interpretation of the Bible that they will have. And also there's a measure by an old colleague of mine from Fargo and his PhD student, Michael Robinson and his old student Federman. They have a measure of metaphoricity, of a preference of a metaphorical rendering of an idea versus a literal rendering of that idea. So that would also be
Go ahead, Patrick. You wanted to ask something.
Yeah, just one last. So thanks for getting into the nitty-gritty details of the methods and stuff. But I wanted to return before we wrap this up to the larger philosophical issues around the whole experience of awe, because it's such an interesting experience, and I don't know of any theology of awe or philosophy of awe, or even an evolutionary theory or biology of awe. There's certainly psychology of awe, and that's a lot of wonderful work been done there. But I'm just trying to, like ask myself, like, whence comes this experience of awe? I mean, obviously we're small creatures, or, and we're faced with this extraordinary universe, extraordinary world, and we come across these extraordinarily beautiful things in life, or horrifying events, or whatever. But I mean, is awe just a limit experience? When the brain sort of gets overwhelmed, it can no longer process what's going on, and current predictive models just collapse. Like ego dissolution. Maybe it's like that, or is it something that's, I don't know. I mean, evolutionarily more adaptive, you might say, or I mean, is there more like a functional thing to it, or I don't know. It's a very intriguing phenomena. I haven't had a chance to think about.
I must say that in the States, I don't know about in the Netherlands, but the use of the word awesome has exploded. And you wonder how it shapes somebody's description of an experience in which they feel awe. I mean, if you use the term awe, like, this has been an awesome discussion with you, Brian, we could say that, but is it the same meaning of awe that you're investigating? No. So
Right?
I think it's as semantic usage changes depending on time and fashion, you wonder how it influences culture as well, and people's cognitive abilities.
Well, can you say that? Sorry, can you say that last part again? With a change in culture.
Well, with the change of let's just call it fashion, cognitive fashion, how we describe things. Some people might use the word, that's not in my space. That's common these days. People, I mean, it wasn't common when I was growing up, but it's common now. And the use of the term awesome.
Oh, yes.
We overuse it a lot.
Oh, so then it may, that overuse may prevent us access to an experience.
I don't know about preventing, but it would certainly shape it differently, perhaps, than if the term was more restricted.
Yeah.
I think transcendence, for example, perhaps is more restricted at the moment. You don't hear a lot of use of that term, but awesome is all over the place.
Yeah, it's like the word love, If you think about the agapic love of Christianity, I mean, what a profound, radical thing that is. And then, it's completely lost within the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the reasons why I think your work is going to be really interesting, and the results that you get from it, it's really going to help us better understand these kinds of ideas and experiences that people, I would say, often struggle with a little bit. Anybody who reads the Bible, for example, has to certainly on their own has to make a decision whether they accept what they're reading. You mentioned Genesis, for example. If you're a literalist, obviously you're gonna say that happened. I don't know exactly when, maybe the time frame's off, but that's how it happened. Or if you might look at it metaphorically in some way, perhaps not the best way if you're a woman necessarily. Seems to have caused some trouble in the garden, but in general, I think these notions are so important to how we find meaning in life, one of the things you're so interested in. So I'm really looking forward to the results here. And I'm sure anybody who views this video will want to come back in a couple of years and say, what they find out, what happened there?
Nothing. The brain is exactly the same in all conditions.
Or you might find out there is no meaning to life.
But that is a finding.
The no result.
Yeah, no results are not always bad.
Before we hang up, Brian, can you say just a couple of words about what I was asking about?
Yeah.
Sort
Yeah, I was actually even trying to think of maybe some of what both of you were saying, kind of it's fitting together in my head a bit. So, I mean, you mentioned a lot of really good questions. So I'll start and then tell me if I'm not really on the track enough for you. As far as the adaptive element, I mean, it seems there's a lot of theories within psychology, even Piaget, right? That to be adaptive, or natural selection from an evolutionary perspective, to be adaptive, there has to be a balance between a conservative element and a progressive element. There has to be some element of stability, but then things change, the world changes, the environment changes, you change. And if you just stay at that level of stability, then you become rigidified and static and fragile. But if you can have some element of overcoming that and incorporating the new information, then could, I think, lead to what Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragility, that you become stronger. So do you think that one way of thinking about a lot of spiritual practices, and also the spiritual experiences like awe, would be that it helps to transcend the sense of self that may be holding one back from, I mean, all these people, there's spiritual experiences. It's like it's a reordering of their understanding of themselves in the world, and they say that it's bigger and more meaningful.
So it
So
frees
there, I would
us
say,
from outdated models,
yes,
outdated predictive models.
yes,
Of course, that's how science works too, if it works right. You
Oh,
know, it works in much the same way. And I think that's part of, you were sort of alluding to that, I think a little bit before, Brian. There's a tension there. There's a kind of tension between, so do you, I think some people would come and say, well, what do you don't need religion for that, right? It's not necessary. You could get that from another discipline or another way of being. Or are you saying you need religion for that?
well, good, but then what kind of reality are you looking for? Are you looking for a sort, what was it? There's elements of truth. Is it coherence and then correspondence? It's like a correspondence truth. Yeah, then science is excellent for that. I was reading a book recently. It's really good. It's by Von Hendy, The Modern Construction of Myth. It's a really good book. He's talking about some philosopher, Philip Wheelwright, I think it was. He said he wanted to add a third element of truth, which is like an intuitive mode of truth, which is, I think, what Eliade's talking about. So it's not about, material reality, things that you can test in an empirical study, but nevertheless, it feels like you're connected noetically to something deeper, and it feels more real. So yes, science is excellent if it's working right. Just trying to get grant money and all these things that doing bad practices for that one type of truth. But perhaps the awe experiences and religious practices will be better for the other sort of truth.
Could be, but intuitive truths can be dangerous. Like, Q, for example, in the United States.
Yeah. So, so that's why I was bringing back to something you had just said, which is like, when you're on your own, reading and trying to figure it out. So it seems to me this is like one of the losses of institutionalized religion, the culture of it, and the accumulated expertise in realizing that there are people who would have some authority, because it's easier now, with Protestantism, like everybody's their own priest, but you become a priest of the QAnon, exactly. There's nothing there's no good feedback from tradition, from authority, not authority in a bad way, but authority by people who know something. So I think there's this question as well, like the importance of religious community, just in general.
Correcting error and delusion.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. Wow. What an exciting conversation, Brian.
It was great. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to keep tabs on you, man, because you got lots of interesting results coming that we want to hear about. So thanks again for joining us today. And I hope people coming and viewing this interview will appreciate the lengths that Brian has gone to develop his research and to try to answer really interesting questions. So thanks for joining us, Brian, and we hope you have a beautiful day today and the rest of the week.
Thank you
Thanks a
very
lot,
much.
Brian.
Take care.
See ya, everybody. Bye.
Bye.